I've always believed that the forest has a memory. After all, I spent most of my life working as a ranger, patrolling trails, keeping watch over wildlife, and ensuring visitors respected the land. For 3 decades, the forest had been my second home, and its whispers had long become familiar to me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth, these were sounds I could interpret without a second thought. Yet, there were moments that defied logic, things I'd buried in the back of my mind, rationalizing them as coincidences or tricks of the light. Ripped clothing with strange symbols etched on the fabric, odd carvings on tree trunks, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched when I was certain no one else was there. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after too many hours alone in the wilderness. It was my last day on the job, and I thought it would be one of reflection and closure. My duties that morning had been simple: check the trails, ensure all equipment was stored away, and prepare to hand the keys over to the next ranger. The thought of retirement filled me with a bittersweet mix of relief and sadness. As I walked the trails for the final time, I tried to soak in every detail: the sun filtering through the dense canopy, the crisp air tinged with the scent of pine. Then I saw it, a fresh carving on an oak tree near one of the main paths. The symbol was eerily similar to the ones I'd found years ago, a circular pattern intersected by jagged lines, almost ritualistic in nature. It hadn't been there the day before. My stomach knotted, but I brushed it off, convincing myself it was a prank. Kids carving things into trees wasn't unheard of, after all. Still, a familiar unease crept in, one I hadn't felt in years. I finished my patrol early, eager to leave the forest behind and focus on the future. But as I packed my truck and began driving down the gravel road that would lead me out for the final time, a nagging sense of dread lingered in the pit of my stomach. The drive through the forest was always a quiet one. At night, the trees seemed to press closer to the road, their shadows stretching long and menacing under the pale glow of my truck's headlights. I had traveled this road countless times, but that night it felt different. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally silent, as though every creature had chosen to hold its breath. I focused on the road ahead, my fingers gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. It was just the nerves of leaving, I told myself. 3 decades of routine were about to end, and that was bound to stir up emotions. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. My heart jumped as I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a figure standing by the roadside. It was faint, a silhouette partially obscured by the trees, but I was certain it was there. I slowed the truck and craned my neck to get a better look, but by the time I turned my head, the figure was gone. Just tired, I muttered to myself, trying to laugh off the unease creeping into my chest. I turned the radio on, hoping the static-filled music would fill the void of silence, but it only seemed to amplify the isolation. A few minutes later, I saw it again, this time more clearly. The figure was standing at the edge of the road, draped in a tattered cloak or robe. My blood ran cold when I noticed the faint glint of something metallic hanging from its neck, just like one of the strange objects I'd stumbled upon during my patrols years ago. I accelerated, my pulse quickening. The image lingered in my mind even as the figure disappeared into the darkness. Memories of all the unexplained things I'd encountered over the years rushed back to me. The symbols, the objects, the eerie feeling of being watched, they were no longer coincidences. The road stretched endlessly before me, and for the first time in my career, I felt genuinely afraid. I kept driving, my heart hammering in my chest as the forest seemed to grow darker around me. The headlights illuminated the winding path ahead, but my thoughts kept drifting to the figure I'd seen. My grip on the steering wheel was tight enough to make my knuckles ache, but I couldn't loosen it. For a moment, I questioned everything. Had the long years in the forest finally taken their toll? Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, fueled by the unease of leaving behind the only life I'd known. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The figure was real, and it had been waiting. As the road turned sharply, I glanced in the rearview mirror out of instinct. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was there again, closer this time, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my taillights. I could see its features more clearly now. The robe hung loosely, covered in symbols I recognized all too well, and the metallic object around its neck gleamed like a pendant. Its face was obscured, but those piercing, unblinking eyes seemed to burn into me even through the glass. Panic surged through me, and I pressed the accelerator harder. My truck roared forward, but the figure didn't vanish this time. Instead, it stepped forward, and for a fleeting second, I swore it smiled, or what I thought was a smile. The thought made my stomach churn. I turned my eyes back to the road and refused to look again. I focused on the sounds of the truck's engine, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires, anything to distract me from the image burned into my mind. Minutes passed, and the figure didn't appear again. I told myself it was over, that I was safe. But then, as I rounded a bend, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. In the middle of the road ahead lay one of the objects I'd found in the forest years ago. A small, crudely carved wooden idol with the same strange symbols etched into it. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just inches from the idol. My heart raced as I stared at it through the windshield. The eerie glow of the headlights cast long shadows, making the object seem almost alive. I didn't dare get out of the truck. Every instinct in me screamed to keep moving, to leave it behind, but my curiosity got the better of me. Gripping the flashlight from the console, I stepped out into the cold night air. The forest was silent, so silent that even my breathing felt deafening. I crouched to get a better look at the idol. The symbols etched into the wood were crude but deliberate, and the faint scent of charred wood lingered in the air. My mind raced with questions. Who had left it here, and why? Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic crunching in the snow behind me. Footsteps. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I slowly turned around. There, standing just a few feet away, was the figure. It was closer than ever, its face still hidden in shadows, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. The metallic pendant around its neck glinted faintly, and its hand reached out, as if beckoning me. Panic overtook me, and I scrambled back into the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands fumbled to start the engine, and for a terrifying moment, the truck refused to roar to life. The figure stood motionless, watching, waiting. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I floored the accelerator, leaving the idol and the figure behind. My heart pounded as I sped down the winding road, but the sense of relief was short-lived. In the mirror, I saw the figure again, this time running after the truck with an unnatural speed. Its movements were jerky, almost inhuman, and the sight sent a chill down my spine. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. All I could do was drive, praying that the forest would finally let me go. I drove faster than I ever had before, my truck groaning in protest as it tore down the uneven forest road. The branches above seemed to close in, their skeletal shapes clawing at the night sky. I could still feel the figure's presence, though I didn't dare look in the mirror again. My chest tightened with every passing second, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel. The road straightened ahead, and for a moment, hope flickered in my chest. I was nearing the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to open land and the town's lights would be visible in the distance. If I could just reach the highway, I'd be safe. But as I approached the last bend in the road, the truck lurched violently, the back tires skidding as if something had grabbed them. I slammed the brakes, gripping the wheel to steady the vehicle. My breath came in ragged gasps as the truck groaned to a halt. The forest around me was deathly quiet. Even the wind had stilled, as if holding its breath. I hesitated, my heart pounding as I reached for the flashlight again. Stepping out, I kept the door open, the engine idling behind me. The rear tires had sunken into the soft earth, but that wasn't what made my stomach drop. Around the truck, the ground was littered with the same wooden idols I'd found over the years. Dozens of them, each positioned deliberately, forming a rough circle. The carvings seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as if alive. Then I heard it, a low, guttural hum, like a chant carried on the wind. It came from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder with each passing second. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest, and a cold dread settled over me. I knew I had to get out of there. I climbed back into the truck, slamming the door shut and flooring the accelerator. The wheels spun uselessly in the soft earth, but I refused to let panic take over. Rocking the truck back and forth, I managed to gain traction, breaking free of the idle circle. The engine roared as the truck surged forward, and I didn't stop until the trees thinned and the open road stretched out before me. The highway came into view, its streetlights glowing faintly in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. My mind raced, replaying the events of the night. The idols, the figure, the unnatural hum. It all felt like a nightmare I couldn't escape. As I crossed the boundary of the forest, I dared to glance in the rearview mirror one last time. The figure stood at the tree line, perfectly still, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It didn't follow me this time, but its presence lingered, an unspoken promise that it wasn't over. I reached the town just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. Pulling into the driveway of my small house, I sat in the truck for a long time, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. When I finally stepped out, my legs trembled beneath me. Inside, I locked every door and window, drawing the curtains tightly. But even then, I couldn't escape the forest. Its shadows clung to me, invading my thoughts and dreams. I told myself it was over, that the figure couldn't reach me here, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. Weeks turned into months, and I tried to move on, burying myself in the routines of retirement. But the memories refused to fade. Every time I passed a wooded area, I felt the weight of those eyes on me, unblinking and unrelenting. Even now, years later, the forest calls to me in whispers I can't ignore. Sometimes, I find idols on my doorstep, their carvings eerily familiar. I don't know if it's my mind playing tricks on me or if the figure is still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. All I know is that I'll never step foot in the forest again. Not after what I saw. Not after what it showed me. I never thought the forest would haunt me even after I left. When I retired as a park ranger 10 years ago, I believed the weight of the woods would lift, that the shadows would recede. But the truth is, there are some nights when I can still hear the forest calling me. It was during my last week on the job that everything changed. I had spent over 2 decades patrolling those woods, growing familiar with every trail, every sound. The forest was my home as much as my cabin was. But in that final week, something shifted. The air felt heavier, the usual sounds of wildlife fell eerily silent, and the trees seemed to loom closer, as if they were watching. It started during a routine night patrol. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I walked the northern trails. I remember spotting something unusual. Deep tracks in the ground, larger than any animal native to the region. They were spaced out as if whatever made them had an enormous stride. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but the shape was all wrong. I followed the tracks for nearly an hour, my unease growing with each step. The trail led me to a clearing I hadn't seen before. In the moonlight, I noticed something chilling. Large stones arranged in a circle, with strange carvings etched into them. At the center was a makeshift altar, weathered by time but still holding an air of ritualistic purpose. The air grew colder as I stepped closer. Suddenly, I felt a presence, something heavy, oppressive, and watching. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, just out of the reach of my flashlight. I froze, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but my curiosity won out. I tried to shine my light on the figure, but it vanished into the trees as if it were never there. When I finally forced myself to leave the clearing, the forest felt alive in a way it never had before. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, made me spin around, expecting to see the shadow again. By the time I returned to my cabin, my nerves were frayed, and my hands trembled as I locked the door. I spent the next day trying to shake off the unease. The sunlight streaming through the trees helped a little, but I couldn't stop thinking about the clearing. By evening, I convinced myself to investigate further. It was my last week after all, and if something strange was happening in the woods, I wanted to know before I left for good. As darkness fell, I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and headed back toward the northern trails. The forest was unnervingly quiet again, the usual chorus of crickets and owls absent. When I reached the clearing, it was as if the air itself resisted me, growing thicker with every step. The altar was just as I had left it, but something new caught my eye. Fresh scratches marred the stones, as if an enormous claw had raked across them. The thought of an animal doing this made my skin crawl. Nothing in this forest had claws that size. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the clearing. My flashlight flickered, and when the beam stabilized, I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, cloaked in shadow. Its eyes glowed an unnatural amber, piercing through the darkness. It wasn't human, though its shape suggested otherwise. I raised my rifle, but my hand shook so violently that I couldn't aim. The figure didn't move closer. It simply stood there, watching me. The growl grew louder, and my instincts screamed for me to run. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and when I looked up again, the figure was gone. I sprinted back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart pounded as I double-checked every lock and window. For hours, I sat in silence, gripping my rifle and staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open. When dawn finally came, I told myself I must have imagined it, that the stress of retirement was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the forest had shown me something real, and it wasn't done with me yet. The following day, I tried to dismiss the previous night as a hallucination, a product of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But the unease lingered, settling into my bones like a winter chill. Every noise outside my cabin felt amplified. The rustle of leaves sounded like whispers, and the creak of old wood reminded me of distant footsteps. I spent the day avoiding the northern trails, but curiosity gnawed at me. Could I have imagined it all? The growl, the glowing eyes, the altar? I busied myself with packing and checking my equipment, trying to distract myself from the pull of the woods. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I felt that oppressive weight again, a silent beckoning from the forest. Against my better judgment, I decided to patrol one last time. I told myself it was to ensure no one had trespassed or vandalized the area. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed answers. I avoided the northern trails, opting instead for a route that circled the outskirts of the forest. The air was still unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something strange. Deep claw marks had gouged several trees along the path, leading back toward the clearing. Whatever had been there the night before had moved. As I stood frozen, trying to decide whether to follow the marks, a sound stopped me cold, heavy breathing, coming from the trees behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, and caught a glimpse of something moving between the trunks. It was fast, too fast to follow, and I only caught flashes of its silhouette. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The breathing stopped, replaced by a guttural, almost human-like laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. I backed away, rifle raised, scanning the trees for movement. The laugh echoed again, this time closer. Then I saw it, those same glowing amber eyes staring at me from the shadows. I didn't wait this time. I turned and ran, my boots crunching against the forest floor as I sprinted toward the cabin. The laughter followed me, a taunting reminder that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached my door and slammed it shut, my lungs burned, and my heart felt like it would burst. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, rifle in hand, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest felt alive, as if it was pushing closer, its shadows reaching for me. The next morning, the sunlight did little to ease my fear. I debated leaving the cabin entirely, cutting my last week short and heading to the city. But something about the forest wouldn't let me go. It felt like it had a hold on me, a demand to understand what I had seen. I decided to return to the northern trails during the day, hoping the light would make the place feel less menacing. As I approached the clearing, the air grew colder again, just like before. The altar stood in the center, but now there were new additions. Animal carcasses lay scattered around the stones, arranged in a grotesque pattern. Their lifeless eyes stared at me, and the stench of decay was overwhelming. At the base of one of the stones, I found something that made my blood run cold. My name etched into the rock, alongside strange symbols I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I traced the carving. How could it know my name? Suddenly, the forest erupted in noise. Branches snapped, and the underbrush rustled as if something massive was moving toward me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. Then I saw it again, the figure with glowing amber eyes, stepping into the clearing. It spoke this time, its voice low and guttural, almost indistinguishable from the growl I had heard before. "You shouldn't have returned." I turned and ran, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps chasing me all the way back to the cabin. Slamming the door shut, I bolted it and grabbed my rifle. But the figure didn't follow me this time. Instead, I heard its voice echoing through the trees, as if it was everywhere at once. "You belong to the forest now." The words echoed in my mind long after the forest fell silent. "You belong to the forest now." I couldn't escape them, and their weight settled over me like a suffocating fog. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind against the window felt like a reminder that I wasn't alone. The forest was alive, watching, waiting. I tried to call for help, but my radio crackled uselessly. It was as if the forest itself was blocking the signal. I considered walking to the nearest ranger station, but the thought of stepping outside felt like a death sentence. My supplies would last a few more days, but beyond that, I'd have to face the forest again. That night, I stayed up with my rifle by my side, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the usual hum of the wind and the distant rustle of branches. But as the hours stretched on, the noises began to change. The sound of footsteps circled the cabin, deliberate and slow, like a predator stalking its prey. I peered out the window, my breath fogging the glass. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw them. Not just one figure, but many. Their glowing amber eyes pierced the darkness, and they stood still, as if waiting for something. For me. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a nightmare brought on by isolation and fear. But deep down, I knew the truth. They were real. And they weren't going to let me leave. At dawn, I gathered my courage. I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. It was clear the forest had me surrounded, but sitting there waiting for whatever came next felt worse. I packed my essentials into a small bag, double-checked my rifle, and prepared to make a run for it. As I stepped outside, the air felt heavy, almost alive. The forest was eerily quiet, but I could feel eyes on me. I decided to head east, toward a ranger station about 5 miles away. The trail was overgrown, as if the forest had been working to erase it. Every step felt like a test. Shadows seemed to shift in the corner of my vision, and the sound of distant footsteps echoed behind me, though I never saw anyone. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath and noticed something on my arm. A faint mark, almost like a brand, had appeared overnight. It matched the symbols I'd seen on the altar. Panic surged through me. Was this the forest's way of claiming me? I pushed forward, desperate to escape. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. Branches snagged at my clothes, roots tripped me, and the air grew colder with every step. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, I was bruised, bloodied, and barely holding on. But I made it. Standing on the open road, I turned back to look at the forest. The glowing amber eyes watched from the shadows, but none of them crossed the tree line. For now, I was free. I left the ranger station the next day, handing in my resignation without a second thought. I couldn't explain what I'd seen. Who would believe me? But I knew one thing for sure. The forest wasn't just a place. It was something alive, something ancient, and it had marked me. Years later, I still feel its pull. Every time I drive past a dense patch of trees, I feel those eyes watching me. Sometimes, I dream of the clearing, of the altar and the glowing eyes. And when I wake up, the mark on my arm seems brighter, like a reminder that the forest hasn't forgotten me. I've avoided the woods ever since, but deep down, I know it's only a matter of time. The forest always gets what it wants. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.